listen, it's wonderful to see you all 334 and rising. I'm Jonathan Rowson. I'm Chief Executive and co-founder of Perspectiva, who are putting on tonight's event. We're also very proud publishers of Iain's most recent book, The Matter with Things. I'm going to work on the assumption that you know Iain pretty well, but he is, as well as a now quite famous author, and I use quite there more in the North American sense of very, rather than the sort of British sense of not so much. Really, now very, very much a famous and celebrated writer and thinker with an increasingly international reputation. So it's no wonder that so many of you are here to see him. Tonight, we're going to carry on our series called Attention as a Moral Act. And we've spoken already in the first session about what we meant by that. We might sort of reiterate it a little bit tonight. Some of you may know the first session was between Iain and I. We were sort of trying to reassert, reaffirm, reestablish the nature of Iain's most fundamental argument. We spoke a little bit about my own take on it, calling it the McGilchrist maneuver, and we tried to establish what that was. And we just more generally sort of updated ourselves prior to the plunge into the more specific aspects of the book. In the second session, we spoke with Zachary Stein, who had an amazing conversation with Iain about value as a fundamental feature of the cosmos. It was a very richly metaphysical, somewhat spiritual, fundamental conversation about the nature of reality. And we've had a great deal of positive feedback about it since. As some of you may know, in between our sessions, we also have bi-weekly connection and inquiry sessions, which are run by Michael and Lee, my colleagues. And so if you have questions or you want to have further conversations, you're welcome to just go to those events. And, they're quite informal, and you have a chance to reflect and do some practices and get to know the work a bit more deeply. Tonight, we have an unusual situation, which is that earlier today, I was in touch with Bonnitta Roy, whom I've known for quite some time, and she gave me chapter and verse on how she's prepared for this evening's event, and she will be joining us very shortly. For some reason, we can't currently contact her, and we're waiting for her to arrive. So I'm going to briefly introduce her. I hope that she shows up, and if she doesn't show up, I'm going to begin speaking to Iain myself, partly based on Bonnitta's notes. But it's just a matter of time until she shows up, because we have now reminded her, and my only assumption is that she may have got the time zone conversion mixed up because of some daylight saving time change, which we thought we were on top of, but evidently not. So give us a few minutes as she manifests herself. Bonnitta, many of you will know already, but many of you may not. And she's really a rather extraordinary human being with a multitude of different character traits, skills, assets, interests. It's quite rare for someone to get deeply into metaphysical philosophy. And by that, I don't mean so much the metaphysical in the sort of new age, sort of irrational kind of philosophy. I mean more profoundly an engagement with metaphysics as it's studied in classical philosophy and in analytic philosophy. And she's written papers on why metaphysics matters. She wrote one of the most profound chapters in a book released by Perspectiva Press called Dispatches from a Time Between Worlds. And it was about the idea of metamorphosis. And a lot of Bonnitta's work is about emphasizing not just the kind of how we have to improve things, but also a little bit about how we have to allow things to end. Michael, are you showing me signs of life there, or am I imagining it? I'm imagining it. Okay. So Bonnitta is also a horse trainer, a farmer, and like Iain, she describes herself as a Taoist. One of my favorite conversations with her was when she spoke about the enormous tomatoes that she had in her farm after using some unsuspecting variety of manures to make them grow. But she'll switch from that to speaking about, whitehead and hartshorn and so on. So Bonnitta is a rather extraordinary person, and I'm very much hoping she'll join us in just a second. Let me just check. I'm just noticing I have a problem with my battery. So if I disappear too, Michael, you'll have to take it up. Okay. I think I've got it covered, but just a second. So I want to start, Iain, with a question that Bonnie was going to ask you. She had something else to say first, but I'll let her say that because it's very personal to her. She was very interested in your subtitle. She wants to understand a little bit more about After the Matter with Things, which you might want to remind us why you chose that title. More precisely, the subtitle, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. And I know it took you quite a while to come up with that. But if you can share anything about why exactly those words and what you're getting at, I know that's one thing Bonnie wanted to ask you.
Well, of course, in choosing the title in The Matter with Things, I was addressing myself to the idea that we often have problems understanding elements of our experience because we thingify them. We see them as things, and in essence, many of the things that we think of in this way, I think are better thought of as adverbs, probably. In other words, they are not elements that we have to pin down or we can find in certain places, but they are ways in which we relate to everything else that exists. And so the idea would be that you don't look for an entity, but a web of relationships that allows what this entity is thought to refer to become real. It's always a reverberative relationship. Why I chose the subtitle is, of course, it has a kind of glancing nod towards the subtitle of The Master and His Emissary.
Right.
But what I'm talking about there is that I believe that we've started to use our brains in a particularly limited way. When I say started, I think we've been doing it now for a couple of 100 years at least, in which we disattend to whatever it is the right hemisphere is able to tell us, and instead focus on what the left hemisphere would have us believe. And the delusions comes from, as I demonstrate in the first 9 chapters of the book, which are all dedicated to neuroscience. And it's more fascinating, I hope, than that makes it sound. It's not abstract. It's looking at what actually happens to people and their lives and their world and their whole way of being when part of their brain is not functioning correctly. And this may be because of an injury to the right hemisphere or a stroke in the right hemisphere, but it may also be because of developing a disease such as schizophrenia, which has many, many, many parallels with a right hemisphere deficit state. And I go into all of that in that chapter. So, and the left hemisphere is literally deluded. And that's not just me who says that. I mean, I'm very happy to quote other neuropsychiatrists who say, yes, the left hemisphere is on its own deluded. Sorry, Jonathan, are you?
No, just for a point of clarification, because the word delusion is used a lot, and I know you're very precise with your words. It's one of the reasons people love your work so much. What exactly is a delusion? I mean, as opposed to an unreality, an illusion, and lots of other concepts around it. What makes a delusion as such?
Well, I think the standard definition is something like an incorrigible false belief that is not explained by the person's culture or other context.
Right.
So, there are things that we would call unexplained false beliefs, but they're part of somebody's religion, and it doesn't mean that they've become crazy. It means that because of belonging to that religion, that's the way they think, for example. And so it's got to be something, and it's not just false, but it is in this sense incorrigible, because there are false beliefs which can be corrected, but in the case of a delusion, it is pointless arguing with somebody about it, because you're relying on a shared way of seeing the world that is, as it were, yours and mine and the patient's, in order to explain to the patient that this cannot be the case.
Right.
But you've got to remember that for the patient, the whole world that they are experiencing is based on this certain way of that certain disposition towards it, this way of experiencing it. And so it's a very obvious and common observation that however bizarre a delusion is, it is absolutely fruitless trying to argue with the patient about whether this is evidentially likely.
Right, right.
And it's there's a sort of grey area where, for example, you may believe that your spouse is unfaithful to you, and your spouse may be being unfaithful to you, but there is still a delusional way of believing it, because you believe it not in the way that somebody would normally frame this, but you believe it with a sort of determination and on the basis of evidence that other people would not consider a reasonable basis for making decisions. So there's no very, very clear way of putting it.
Right.
But when you meet somebody who's deluded, you sure know what you're encountering.
Right.
And I believe that we as a society have started to believe obviously false things about ourselves that experience, intuition, the business of living would tell us must be false and have always been seen by people as false, but we now believe them to be the case. So that's that bit about the delusions and the unmaking of...
Jerry, before you get to the unmaking, I just want to get the delusions very clear, because again, as with last week, or 2 weeks ago, when we had the necessary but sometimes confusing elision between value and values, with delusion and delusions, I'm just curious, you're speaking in the subtitle about particular delusions that you outline in those chapters that you mentioned. But there's also something you say about shared reality here. So I'm just wondering the relationship between particular delusions, which might make it difficult for people to interact in a shared reality, and the idea that the whole perception that's shared is somehow deluded, and what it's like. Are we living in both of those kinds of delusion, and if so, what's the relationship between them? And if you don't mind, while you answer that, I have to go and get another charger for my computer, or they will disappear. So I'm still with you, and I'm turning off my video, and I'll be back. So make it a long, good answer. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll do my best. Yes, I see the distinction that Jonathan's making there. And, for example, if we are, as a whole society, seeing things in a certain way, is this still delusional, since part of the idea of delusion is believing something that cannot be explained by your societal beliefs? And I suppose this is a very new situation. I don't think there's been an example in the past where a whole society has been in the grip of ways of thinking that are frankly delusional, and like those that are held by patients with major psychoses who are out of touch with reality. And so this is a new era that we've entered, where, as it were, there is a mass psychosis. And I don't think I'm the only person actually who's used that conception of a mass psychosis. But what we see is that, for example, people with delusions based on the fact that they have got a psychotic illness will find many things apparent that we would not think apparent, and make things that we do see apparent as completely improbable or impossible. And I mean, I could go back to chapter 9, which is the chapter in which I do look at schizophrenia, but just illuminate possibly I would say about 30 different ways in which people with schizophrenia demonstrate the same sorts of aberrational thinking that we do.
Right.
And one thing that's interesting about this is that I mean, a lot of it one might think is because we're interacting with machines. People with schizophrenia see themselves as machines often, and call themselves machines, and have been known to do things like cut open their wrists to see whether there's blood or engine oil in their veins. Right. So they can often have this very disturbing feeling that nothing is right. It's all mechanical. It's all abstracted engineering rather than anything embodied. Sorry, are you?
I put my hand up because I've got an email notification from our esteemed guest that she's waiting to be let in.
Good.
Yeah, I just want to say,
hey,
so here we go.
Okay. You've managed to bring
fabulous.
Yeah, and I'm just going to
bring Bonnitta up to speed then and let you take over from there. Hi, Bonnie. Nice to see you. Are you with us?
I am sorry. I'm so sorry about my tardiness.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Good to
Don't worry.
good to have you with us. You may not, I know you've been in touch with Iain by email, but nice to introduce you, albeit in front of 300 odd people. So Iain, I've spoken with many times, and I think you'll know, Bonnie, I've already introduced you to some extent to the audience. What I didn't mention is that over the last year or so, you've, maybe more than a year now, you've created something with a lovely, fetching, straightforward title, a pop-up school. And just briefly tell us what your pop-up school is, so that before we get into the discussion, people get a better sense of where you're coming from.
Well, hi, Iain. Nice to see you.
Hello,
nice to see
Bonnitta.
everyone.
Yeah.
For almost 15 years, I taught a master's course in consciousness studies and transpersonal psychology, or transformational psychology, which we called it at the end. And COVID pretty much was the straw that broke the back for that program, which was always kind of an off-Broadway struggling private program. And I graduated my last cohort in August of 2022. And in August of 2021, kind of anticipating the end of that, I wanted to offer something similar that was equally robust, that could speak to what people were starving for, but had a much lower onboarding threshold. So instead of paying $17,000 a year, you could pay like $40 a month. And I kind of modified Substack so people could enroll on and off, or enroll on a yearly basis. And I called it the pop-up school because in Zach Stein, whom you met a couple of weeks ago, Iain, in his book, he predicted that schools might be these little pop-up initiatives. And I wanted to give it this sense of like serial learning, like you could pop in and pop out. And so it's been almost 2 years now, and it's quite a growing community. And I suspect there's several of the students or our community on this call today.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to hear it. And Bonnie, while you're getting settled, just as far as I understand it, where we were in the conversation was I asked, I didn't say anything about your observations about the book, but I did use your email from this morning to ask Iain about the subtitle. And so we spoke a little bit about why the matter with things. We spoke a little bit about brains, which could be somewhat self-evident. We spoke a little bit about delusions and the difference between delusion, sort of singular, and delusions plural, and individual and collective delusions, but only really scratched the surface of that. And Iain was just about to come on to the unmaking of the world when various things kicked off, including my computer running out of battery. So Iain, if you want to finish that thought on why the unmaking of the world, allow Bonnitta to get settled. And once you finish that, I'm happy to disappear until the Q&A. So if you can go on the unmaking of the world, Michael, you can allow me to disappear.
Yes.
And then you carry on talking together, and I'll be back for the Q&A in about 50 minutes.
Yes, what I wanted to indicate by the phrase the unmaking of the world is that the various habits of mind that I believe are toxic, which we've adopted more in the last few decades, but certainly going back further than that, the last century or two, lead to us no longer having a world. And a world is a very special thing, if you like to put it that way. It's an experience, really, like all the things I talk about. That it's not really a thing, but it's a place in which we dwell. It's a home. It's a living thing, and therefore, in schematizing, mechanizing, abstracting, decontextualizing, ignoring the uniqueness of individual cases, ignoring the individual uniqueness of people, we have come to inhabit an enormously impoverished version of what that world should be. We're in a sort of lost place, which has none of the feel of a living, vibrant world in which we are committed, orientated, and find our place of being. That's really what I was getting at.
Yeah, so thank you. You know, when I read that, I was struck by, I just had this impression you put a lot of thought into the subtitle, and that it was very, it was a more poignant message maybe than a lot of people might think about at first. You know, something that strikes me as being of grave concern, I think there's a lot at stake. I think you would agree that there's a lot at stake. And I think sometimes people think, yeah, they take you seriously, but they think it's like a metaphor. And I think that it's more than a metaphor. It's more than a passing concern. It's more than, you know, almost a sci-fi movie, let's say. Some people with like all these crises go into their consciousness like it's almost a sci-fi movie, you know? It makes us nervous, but I think that, like, for me, a lot of what you're talking about, I see every day. I've seen the erosion of the adult mind through the 15 years that I've been teaching. And, you know, of course, my course selects so people who have maybe a little bit of spiritual emergencies and stuff, but the nature of the question of whether reality is real is extraordinary now. And these programs that people go to that question whether we share a same world or we all have different worlds, you know, there's this, and I know the sense in which we all live in our own perspective, but the emphasis is always on that the world is a simulation, that we share different worlds, like this sense the humanities and the science are teaching this extraordinary fragmentation and I call it locked in syndrome, that we can't perceive the world really. And my question for you is where is the fever? Why are we so feverishly trying to convince ourselves that we live in a simulation? I mean, where is that pain coming from, that we don't want to live in, let's say, the natural world?
Gosh, there's so many things to say about that. Well, one is that the natural world imposes limits on us, like we die and we have bodies that have certain inclinations and so on. We're busy trying to pretend that none of this is true and we can remake everything according to our whim. But that is not the case. And in fact, the limits that are imposed by life are extremely healthful and important. It's a mistake to think that we ought to be railing against them and trying to get rid of them, in my view. But of course, like everything, it's a matter of degree. Nature is something that medicine has always interfered with. Medicine tries to overcome some of the unnecessarily adverse effects of disease and so forth. So we are always juggling these things. I think another reason why we're addicted to this idea of a representation is because the left hemisphere is a representation of the world. The right hemisphere has a presencing of the world. It allows the world to presence to us. That is a vibrant two-way experience. But once it is taken up by the left hemisphere, it is dislocated, dismembered, analyzed, categorized, and turned into something abstract, a map of the world. And you cannot live in a map. You have unmade the world once you do that. But the left hemisphere can only trust the things that it itself has made. It wants to. Heidegger actually said that he was, of course, not talking about hemispheres at all, but he did say that modern man needs to be able to tell himself that he is the giver to himself of everything that he has. And that is part of this problem that we have, that we must be the all-powerful and we must be the one that can do anything. This is extraordinary in a way, because I've, for decades I've been puzzled by the kind of paradox that at the same time we believe ourselves to be capable of doing almost anything we want to, and believe ourselves to be basically pointless, worthless. So the dignity of humanity has hugely plummeted, and so is its happiness and its sense of belonging and everything else. At the same time that our hubris about humanity has gone through the roof. So adopting a certain degree of modesty and a sense of proper limits to what we can do and what we can know would actually perhaps help us to regain a sense of respect for what we in fact are and what we can do. But those would be some of the thoughts I'd have about why that is so promoted. And I'm afraid it is very much promoted. And I just like to say that there are a number of philosophers, quite amongst the foremost at the moment is Donald Hoffman, who says that what we see is a readout of an instrument panel. This is an idea that has been offered many times in the past and was really in Damasio's early work as well, for which I criticized him and for which he hasn't forgiven me. But this idea that actually what we're doing is reading out something, which is what the left hemisphere does. But in fact, we are experiencing something real. There are things in the cosmos that correspond to all those things that we perceive and value. Now, I'm not saying that there was only one way of seeing them, but once again, in our culture, what we've done is we've taken a partial truth and made it the whole story. So it is true that everyone, to some extent, sees the world differently, and that's an important and beautiful fact. But it is also a very important and beautiful fact that, generally speaking, we see things in a common world. We don't all live in so vastly different worlds that we have no common ground. And at the moment, there's a general tendency to say that if something is the case up to a degree, which wasn't thought to be so perhaps recently, then it's true to the max across the board. We go to extremes. We have black and white positions. And I'd like to present myself as a foe to black and white positions. It's very important that there are matters of degree and things that are implicit and not fully made explicit.
So you said that, we kind of have this hubris that we imagine ourselves are all powerful, that all the gifts we have, we've made ourselves. And it seems to me that there's a pickle in this, because somehow deep down inside, we do know that we haven't made the earth, and we haven't made the trees, and we haven't made ourselves, and everything that we actually are has been given to us freely by nature through no account of our own. I mean, this is more, it's, people will, when I say that, they say, oh, that's very spiritual. And I say, no, it's just a strong naturalism. It's just actually the case. It's rather mundane. And for me, there's something that if I thought I was responsible for booting up my enthusiasm every morning, I would be overwhelmed. It's like so much of who we are that gives us the possibility to pretend we're all powerful comes to us through this intelligence that we don't have, it's all given to us. So it seems to me like the thing I can't understand is that, and I don't know, does this seem off topic to you, or is this kind of interesting to talk about?
No, it's fine.
Yeah. So I went to a conference the other day, and this young man was presenting an argument that the world is intelligible and that communication between people is possible. And to do that, he took this huge journey through theoretical cognitive science and opponent processing and free energy principle. And I thought something very odd. He's a very nice man. And I thought something very odd is happening here. Like if people had to understand all that, to understand that the world is intelligible, that there's possibility for communication, then most people would be lost. And I thought, like, I told my dog, you have absolutely no chance at all for being in the world, you know? And so this question, this crisis of how, so this is an example of something that looked like a well-presented presentation, but it really was, to me, a sense of collective madness. And yeah.
No, well, this kind of thing goes on all the time. It's as though we've completely lost any kind of contact with the live, intuitive, reverberative business of experiencing the world, in which the world approaches us, becomes available to us, and we to it. And it's in this encounter that whatever it is that we know comes about. So, but what you're describing is this unnecessarily complex way of approaching it. And there's a lot of this in science, in which, frankly, the extraordinarily opposite is, obvious, I meant to say. The extraordinarily obvious is demonstrated at costly and great length, where at the same time, oddly, there are things that are completely obvious that are wholly denied. And people go around believing them because they think, oh, well, people say this, so I better believe it. But I want a bit of the touch of the little boy who said the emperor's wearing no clothes. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, guys, he's nude. There's just so much rubbish talked these days, and it's very confusing, disorientating for people, and leads them to a sense of desperation. They don't know what to believe, who to believe, what to believe in. Their intuitive spirituality has been deadened by the way they've been brought up and by everything they experience in the world. Their capacity to pay continuous, sustained, vigilant attention, open attention, respectful attention, the sort of attention that leads to real sense of meaning and awe, has been undermined. And they've been told they have thousands of choices that in reality are not helpful. And it's a well-known fact in psychological research that beyond a few choices, too many choices make people less happy, more stressed than they would have been content with fewer choices. So it's not, as I'm always saying, it's not an argument for having no choice, but it's an argument for saying that choice doesn't get better and better if you try and say, well, you can be anything you want. You can't. I mean, get real. It's a horrible fantasy that creates enormous stress and the fear of missing out and the fear of having failed and the need to do all kinds of incompatible things at once in order to prove that you're okay. It's a horrible world to bring up young people in. I mean, I just feel for young people whose rates of mental illness are sort of zooming through the roof.
Yeah.
So we do live in a mad world. My masters.
When you think of young people, it's really very sad, and I read in statistics that 1 out of every 16 kids in the United States is diagnosed with a severe mental illness. And whether it's because the DSM has gone mad or the children have gone mad, it doesn't really matter. It's an alarming fact. And, you know, I sometimes I coach some young parents, and we try to teach parents how to have unstructured time with their children. And I often get the response, you know, I blocked out time. She was playing, I was there, nothing was happening, but I got bored. I don't know what to do with my body. I don't know how to put my body in play. I'm just stiff, and I pretend, and this is all by way of trying to say to the listeners, like, it's not a joke and it's not science fiction, and something really disturbing is happening right in front of our eyes. But I thought, I have this note here, and there's this beautiful word that you use, I don't know how to say it, ipsity. Ipsity. And you have a quote from Sass in his book about this crucial sense of self-sameness, a fundamental and therefore nearly indescribable experience of existing as a vital and self-identical subject of experience and action. And I thought, this is one of these experiences that we can no longer take for granted, that people have any intuition of. And so I thought maybe you could, if you were talking to aliens who had not this experience, what is that experience?
The trouble is that it's not something that's improved by being put into words. It's something that has to be experienced. And I take the word ipseity largely from Louis Sass, a very great mind, I think. And what he's talking about there is the natural, unself-conscious awareness of a continuous functioning self. We've so eroded our intuition, and we've been encouraged to attack our intuitions, to reject our intuitions, that we can no longer act unself-consciously. And this happens in schizophrenia. People say, I don't know how to walk. I have to think, put one foot in front of the other, and so on. I don't know how to sit down, or whatever it may be. So they've become paralyzed by a kind of Gorgon stare of the intellect on everything they're doing. And the beauty of life is that things work well only when it's not like that. Imagine how bad the performance of a piece of music would be if the pianist was thinking all the time consciously about what he was doing with his fingers. Imagine how diminished an act of sexual love would be if it was entirely contrived according to a plan, an algorithm, or a worked out schema. It's this way of thinking that is absolutely crazy and a huge affliction, and makes life impossibly difficult for us. The trouble is that if we adopt a legalistic frame of mind, I mean, a lot of this comes back to a sort of legalistic incorporation of the redress in the redress for any kind of wrong that happens to you is to accuse somebody. So nowadays we have this sort of idea, or some people seem to have this idea, that we're owed a pain-free life, and if there's pain, there's suffering, things are not good in it, there's somebody to blame for that, and they must be brought to account, preferably through the law. This has a deleterious effect on whole swathes of life, where in fact we need to trust and to accept that there will be ups and downs and things, but not to become reaching for our handy attorney at every turn in events. This is the problem. And this is why schools find teachers harder to recruit. Hospitals are finding doctors harder to recruit, because first of all, they've been told that unless they follow certain written procedures, they will be vulnerable to being sued, and that will completely destroy their career. And that, nothing any longer can be done according to the wonderful way in which I was taught, and it was taught medicine too, which was from experience, from people who'd had 40 years of experience of whatever it was, talking to me from that base of what goes well and what doesn't. And the teachers at school were people who had an enormous enthusiasm for things that they had learned to love, and they communicated that to me. And that's in itself worth 1,000 hours of just following rules and procedures. It's this awful business of rules, procedures, theories that have overtaken our ability to be naturally responsive creatures. And when we can try to recover that, we may be able to get back some of our moral self, because that's also a very important thing, isn't it? I mean, since we have rules about absolutely everything now, I think back to when I was young, and it's a cliche, but one didn't need to have the same numbers of locks, and there weren't cameras watching everything and so on. But on the whole, although certainly crime existed, it didn't seem to exist on the level that it would if we now took away all the locks and the cameras that we've since instituted. And there's a sort of belief that if you can get away with it, then you're entitled to do so. There's no kind of strong inner sense of, I would never do this because I'm not that kind of person, and I don't want to live in a world where human beings do this kind of thing. That seems to me one of the most important moral stimuli to action. I don't want to do this because I don't want to be in a world where we can assume that people will do this unless some law restrains them from doing it. So we've moved such a terrifically long way from anything intrinsic and spontaneous and intuitive to the world of somebody who is unable to stand unless they've got scaffolding all around them, a support. And of course, such a person is a feeble version of a healthy living individual.
Yeah, and of course,
what do you think about that?
Yeah, and of course, that scaffolding is actually fragmented, right? Just like the self. Like, I was thinking of the other day, we were talking about wisdom, like what is it to cultivate wisdom? And I was saying that years ago, both of us will use that phrase quite a bit, I think. A doctor, for example, could grow wise in his career, right? So he would give birth to children, he'd watch them grow, he'd help their parents in the dying process, he'd be in the community, and this kind of embedded in the community, in the local, with his expertise, having what I call a voluntary obligation to his practice through the thick and thin and the difficulties. This is a formula for having wise people embedded in relationships. But a doctor's career is not a formula for wisdom today. Not at all. It's completely fragmented, and they're systematically standardizing things. So all the doctor does is go on the computer and tell you something. So pretty soon you don't need the doctor. And we feel we've slowly redefined intelligence as something machines are good at. And so you see the standardizing of teaching, the standards of this is what machines are good at. And now we have, Chat GPT is going to be our teachers, because it's better at that than we are. But we've redefined intelligence as what people are good at.
Well, we need to redefine intelligence as what people are good at.
Exactly.
Yes, I always say AI is not artificial intelligence; it's artificial information processing, and that's what it does. But intelligence involves a full understanding, and that can only come if you are embodied, if you have emotions, if you form relations on the basis of that, and if you're aware that you are only here for a while and are going to die. All these things are very important to making us what we are. We need all these elements, including the element of death, which is not our foe, but in many ways our friend. That's a whole other topic. But what I'm really saying is that intelligence is at risk, and I think you're saying this as well, of being replaced by just very rapidly and mechanically following every kind of pathway that a computer can find, but having no sense of a context in which to properly evaluate these things, and will fill in things which are absolutely not true on the basis that it looks like in this pattern this ought to be happening. So it actually states that certain things have happened in a person's life, for example, based on a probability, but they didn't. And that person rather specifically didn't do those things. So, I mean, not only have you got the problem of telling true from false in educating children and students who may waste their time and their teachers' time by using ChatGPT to write their essays. But it will also make the sphere of the law very difficult. Is the evidence fabricated? What do we really believe here? Can we believe something we see our politicians saying? When you can't believe and you can't trust, the civilization collapses. And, that's this wonderful saying, Chinese 3rd century saying of one of the emperors, that for a society, for a civilization to thrive, you need guns, food, and trust. And if you have to do away with one of them, do away with guns. And if you have to do another one, do away with food. But the one you cannot do away with is trust. And we've done away with it. Sorry, I hope I haven't depressed you too badly. Let me think of something else.
No. I saved something good for the end. No, I think that what I'm trying to collaborate with you on is really to open people's eyes. We get so habituated to the way things are, and open people's eyes to see how extraordinarily unmade the world is. I mean, we think we have to encounter people who are paranoid schizophrenics to understand what you're talking about, and yet this kind of unmaking of the world is the world that is being unmade right in front of our very eyes. And
yes, the world is an organism. It's not a machine. And the trouble with the way we think is that we think it's just a machine and can therefore be reduced to parts. And all we find after we've done this is a lot of material elements that have been broken out of a whole. And the whole cannot conceivably be reconstructed from these bits, these inanimate bits. And what I mean by the unmaking of the world is all that structure, all those relationships that enable things or people and the feelings that they have, the experiences they have, to interrelate with one another are being shorn away. The worldview is becoming simpler and simpler and simpler, not because it's approaching truth, but because it's moving away from truth. It's running away to a blatant falsehood, which it feels it can't escape because of a certain way of thinking, which is that the only thing that matters is that we should be able to be in control and amass material goods. Those are the values of the left hemisphere, and all the other important values are better served by the right hemisphere. Anyway, that was what I talked about last week, so we won't go there now.
I think that another thing that another way to look at it, and of course you've done incredible detail on this, is a lot of times people are let's say they're teachers or educators, or they're psychiatrists, or they're spiritual teachers. They assume that the kinds of minds we have is the nature of mind. And then they try to work with that, or people will say, because our minds are constructing reality. And I always say, no, that's the kind of mind we have, thinks it's a simulation. But what I hear you saying is that this integrated mind, and of course we're off balance, so we're going to emphasize what we've lost with the right brain contribution. This kind of mind looks at nature and sees home, and moves around the world and sees that every act of life is a gift from nature, from my home, from where I've become. this kind of mind trusts that there's such a larger intelligence that envelops all of us. And that's like a tissue from which dialogue is possible. You know, the left hemisphere, like the difference between Jake Pansep says, you know, you hold your baby like this and it's right hemisphere to right hemisphere. And yet we're talking at odds. Like we think that if we can come to some conceptually agreed upon solution, then there's a possibility of communication. And I'm saying that like, because our bodies inhabit the tissue of the living world, then this is why the communication is possible. Not because it's an effort in this direction. It should be a joy in this direction. And yeah.
I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, the phrase constructing the world is very important, because it's a fashionable conception, has been since the 60s, that effectively we make up the world according to, you know, who we are and what we want. But I reject this idea that we fabricate it, because that is dependent on this idea that we are cut off from any kind of reality, and that all we have are the bits that come to us in our mind, and we put together a world out of those. But that is not, in my view, the case, because we do have contact with something beyond ourselves. And unless you tell yourself that that cannot be and cut yourself off from it, in which case, of course, you won't find that there is anything beyond yourself. If you don't do that, but cultivate a kind of humble awareness of things that are far beyond what we know right now, you start to experience those things. They start to give you something with which to build the world. And so it's not a fabrication or a construction of the world. It's a helping to bring into being something that is there, to bring it more into being. And we play a part in that. And so the world comes about for each of us in a slightly different way, because if each of us brings something different to it. But this is wonderful. It's not a negation of the idea that there is a common core to the world. It's the idea that each person's contribution brings a slightly different uniqueness to an aspect of the world. We still have something that is vibrant, living, evolving. It's not a finished product. It's a thing that is in process, as we ourselves are in process. And that process is a resonant thing between our consciousness and whatever the rest of the conscious cosmos gives. That's my view of it. So instead of saying that we construct the world or we make it up in some mechanistic engineering way, which is exactly how the left hemisphere would think was the only possible way, we are in fact, if you like, midwifing into existence, helping to birth something that is natural, something that is nature, which is that which is always about to be.
Yeah, so I want to move on a little bit, and there's this notion, this philosophical notion, which I think is true, and that is that reason, I'm going to use the word reason because rationality is associated with just like left brain typically, that reason is isomorphic to reality, in the sense that there's something about human reasoning, and I'm not just talking about the brain, but you can unpack this, that is isomorphic to reality, such that there is the possibility for a direct attunement, let's say.
Yes.
And so that's the first question. And if you can speak to that, then there's a question just to build after that to kind of end.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful observation, and I certainly believe it, and I think I've made it myself. And in a way, it was what Einstein was saying when he said, what is so wonderful and so unexpected is that the world is understandable. Why should the world be understandable by our minds? And the idea that our minds would evolve naturally to understand the world is not necessarily correct. It might have adopted various kind of entirely false positions for a while. in order to deal with a certain situation. But over time, our understanding of the world has increased. I mean, I'm not saying that most of us in the modern world are making the best of that fact, but there is something heroic about the degree to which over thousands of years we have come to understand more and more of the world, and that the world is, as David Deutsch says, speaking to us in English. I mean, he means if English is your natural language. Why is it that when you approach the world speaks to you in your own language? Which is another way of putting Einstein's remark about extraordinary fact. And I think what this gives us is the opportunity to trust what reason tells us, not, as you say, I make this distinction between, it's not really one that's a core English distinction, but we have to have two different words for it. One is for simply the following of rules and procedures in the way that a computer would. And the other is tempering all that with the wisdom that comes from experience, the understanding of context, and so on and so forth. In fact, what a wise judge would do, you know, you're talking about wisdom and wisdom. And interestingly, judges are being more and more constrained by mechanical sets of rules and procedures so that they're no longer free to use wisdom that they've acquired over an arduous training and decades of experience. So that's what I'd say is that these things are naturally resonant. And I do also believe the imagination is like this. And unfortunately, we haven't got time to go into that enormous topic of what is imagination. But with Coleridge and with Schelling and so forth, I take the imagination to be a faculty which enables us to be in touch with reality beyond the things that we can reason about. It's not fantasy which takes us away from reality. He makes a very strong distinction between fantasy and imagination. And imagination, on the other hand, is our one chance of actually feeling our way into the inside of the world and experiencing it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So my last question, actually, somebody asked me to tag on, and that is, so we have this notion that reason is isomorphic with the world. So there's a possibility for not only attunement, but for deep mutuality. So the question then is, what is the relationship between goodness and reason? Because it's a little tricky to say they're isomorphic.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're talking in a different way than we were about whether reason is isomorphic with reality or perhaps even with truth. I distinguish between different kinds of meaning of truth. One being something abstract that we have an analytic path towards and we get closer and finally we get it. And a different one, which is a form of attunement, of coming together, of meeting, of resonating, a completely different kind of sense of truth. And of course, the word truth has as its core this idea of being true to something, of surfaces being true to one another, as a carpenter says, or a couple being true to one another if they love one another. So it is about a relationship that is truthful and real. Goodness, well, all I would say is that reason is obviously another tool that we can use in helping work out what is good, but it shouldn't be the only or the limiting tool, because there is very much more to goodness than calculation. And one of the things that I write about in chapter 26, I think, is the way in which in academia in the West, the philosophy of utilitarianism has more or less ousted every other kind of way of thinking about what is naturally good. And the odd thing is that what is being praised is a way of thinking which is archetypally not good, immoral. To always calculate about things is immoral and often leads you to horrible conclusions, that it's okay to kill one person in order to harvest their organs and give them to 5 other people awaiting transplants, for example. So reason has a dual aspect, as so often, that it can be extremely helpful, but if used in a rigid fashion, it approximates what people who are mentally ill do with it. people who have frontal lobe damage, right hemisphere damage, who are psychopaths, and who have schizophrenia all have in common that their idea of morality is based on rationalizing calculations, whereas I hope that most of the rest of us see it in a broader sense.
Yeah, that was the trick, I think. Now I understand it. Thank you very much. Because what was the tension in his question was in the assumption that goodness is utility, right? So that it was like, well, when I reason, I don't always get the good, but that was more like yeah. So now I understand what that tension was. But when I reason and I don't get what I want, it may be the good. And so then you start to see that there is the potential for more attunement between reason and the good versus reason and then thinking of the good as a utility, especially an ego referential utility. So that was very helpful. Thank you very much. I knew there was
Thank you.
That kind of tension where there's an assumption that is creating the tension in the question. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie, and I hope you don't mind if I come in. You guys, you can. I'm aware, Bonnie, that another question might come to you as you're, watching the questions that follow. But I want to give a chance for the audience to come in now. Before that, I want to ask you one question about something Bonnie alluded to earlier, vis-a-vis what's at stake here. Because we don't often flesh this out, the source of the sense of mattering, because there's a certain intuition about moral acts in our proximity, about good behavior with our peers and then our society, and then you get into the health of the planet. You might think about the cosmos, you might think about the ultimate nature of reality. You might even wonder about life on other planets and other forms of intelligent life, as many do. And I say all of that because I've noticed between the two of you a sort of difference in tenor. I think it's reasonable to say that, Iain, you, although you offer a great deal of emphasis on beauty and love and goodness, and there's a great deal of positivity in your work, it's also true that you lament a great deal about the world, and there's a certain spirit of, let's say, melancholy about how things are turning out, and a sort of urgency to redirect things and reperceive them. That's the premise of your work. Bonnie, with you, I sense something altogether more chipper, something altogether more kind of lively and playful. And I don't know, I don't want to sort of make this too personal, but I am just trying to get at this idea of, what's at stake? Are we talking about the end of human habitation on planet Earth? Are we talking about the capacity to destroy ourselves with exponential technology? Are we talking about the intrinsic value of things that will be destroyed pointlessly? Can you give me some sense, this question of what's at stake, both of you, please, like, what's your sense of why we should care about any of this, if I can ask such a big context question? Like, ultimately, at the end of these searches, what are we trying to protect? What are we trying to safeguard? What is it that actually matters to you both? I think, Iain, yours will be more familiar to people, so I'm going to come to Bonnie first.
It's a great question. So for me, I'm trying to say, don't think what's at stake in the future. Don't worry about what's coming. Don't take what we're saying and draw it out in a narrative arc and figure out what's going to be left, right? We just be with reality right now. Every single person alive is going to die. Is that a crisis? It's just, you know what I'm saying? If I put it within, the meta crisis and everybody will die, you have a different reality to it. If we put it in right here and now, what's at stake is every person in this call could be deeply wedded with reality, deeply feel belonging to the earth, feel the generosity of having been given a life, experience the beauty of the perceptual world. When you read Iain's writing on music, that people don't have those experiences anymore. They're completely robbed of who people are, the fantastic joy and voyage of being a human being is not present in people's lives. They don't know how to get to it. This is what's at stake. And in young people, there's a struggle because they haven't yet forgotten something. And, you know, used to be when I worked with young adults going through the individuation stage, let's say, their problems were like problems with the intergenerational change between their families, how society's conventions had changed. Now they say things like, when I was 7, I felt like I was hooked up to a machine that was sucking out my blood. This is like the metaphors that 7-year-olds use. Like, it's so bad now that young people who are still kind of like organisms, and then they don't blame their parents because they're like, their parents are sucked into the machine. You know, they use these metaphors. It's extraordinary how poignant the lack of living world is for them. And so for me, I think what's at stake is, you know, trying to connect with young people, make a world for them, but right here and now, all the things that you may imagine were possible are possible, as long as you're still a living, breathing organism. And people don't believe that anymore.
Thank you, Bonnie. And yeah, it's lovely to hear you say that. I've heard you say similar things, but it'd be great to hear it again. Iain, makes me think of the unmaking of the world again. Are we to understand that the world is inevitably being unmade, that it has to be unmade for it to be remade, or that we're called in some sense to protect what is already made?
Well, I think what I'm saying is that we are in the process of unmaking the world, not that it has to, or not that it can't be reversed, but that we are. We're simply unmaking it. And that's the predicament we find ourselves in. And
that's not just to be clear, there's some people who, the reason I asked that question in that way is there are some people who want to tear it all down. I have met people of a persuasion. And are they entirely wrong? I mean, how do you see that?
Yes. Quite simply, anybody who wants to just tear down a civilization or tear down a world is crazy, foolish, arrogant. What we need to do is to work with what is, in fact, as I say, not a machine, but an organism, to change the parts that we feel need to be changed and to respect the wholeness of it. And I find myself, after your perfectly accurate portrayal of me as a miserable old git, I find myself curiously more optimistic, perhaps, than Bonnitta, in that I don't think that people lack all these things. I mean, I'm sure she's right that the world is a much less hospitable place than it was for finding these things, for being encouraged to nourish oneself on them. We're offering children a diet of gruel, which is a great shame. But there will always be people who will gravitate towards the magnificence of what there is, and who will see life as you and I think, both see it as an awe-inspiring gift, and that this is a very important way to be. I often think, when people say, what do we do? And this is a famously difficult question to answer. But I was thinking that there would be some value in saying pray. And what I wouldn't mean by that is well, the only thing that's left open to us now is to pray and hope that there's some divine being that will change it all. That's not at all what I mean. What I mean is by adopting a devout, awe-filled, compassionate vision of the world, not striving to know, alter, take, and all the rest, but actually to, first of all, to understand it in all its awe-inspiring complexity. And that if we did that, a lot of things would start happening differently, because so much of what's wrong is due to simple hubris. The pronouncements of people who think we can do it all and only a few more tweaks and we'll be able to achieve this, that, and the other. Well, this is how things get destroyed. It's in all the old mythologies. The arrogant know-it-all upstart who doesn't realize what he's destroying becomes that demiurge that brings the cosmos to ruin. So that's my thinking about that. I'm rather surprised, though, that you ask, Jonathan, so what is it that is worth saving, or what is it that we're trying to save? Because surely the answer to that is everything that inspires in us love and beauty, and it speaks to us of all these things that are so life enhancing. I mean, you can live in a world in which everything is bleak, meaningless, pointless. I mean, you can create that for yourself, but don't kid yourself that that's necessarily the reality. You can also live in a world where you are maximally responsive to what is good, beautiful, and true, and worthy of our love and respect. And don't get me wrong, good, beautiful, and true, there's a reason we have three different words. They're not interchangeable with one another. They sometimes conflict with one another, but nonetheless, they have this family relationship with one another, in which all these positives come together. They don't have to be mechanically related. Doesn't have to be an algorithm saying, go to beauty, then if this, then go to good. Or it just doesn't work like that.
Right. So I got a lot out of that answer, because to be maximally responsive to the possibility of love, or those were not your words, but paraphrasing, the idea of being maximally responsive to what is good, beautiful, and true is what's at stake in some sense. As I understand it. And also it reminds me, back in the day at some seminar or event you were at, I once remember writing something down quickly because the turn of phrase was so beautiful when you put it. You said that life is a superfluous gift calling for gratitude and tenderness. And you said it off the bat as if it was one of many lines, but I love that particular formulation, a superfluous gift calling for gratitude and tenderness. With that thought, I want to bring in the others. Now, the technicalities of what's about to follow are not altogether trivial, so please pay attention. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please type it in the chat while also putting your hand up. It's a double whammy. We're asking you to do both because it helps us to find you. You might think it's just self-evident, but we do have 380 participants, and we can only see them on a relatively small screen, a certain number at a time. So if you raise your hand through the reactions icon, I believe, or at least one of the icons down below, while simultaneously typing your question. In some cases, we'll ask you to speak it. In some cases, we'll read it out. Also, let me say this quite important point. We're very keen to hear from all kinds of people. That I mean men and women, I mean young and old. And so if you're in any doubt about asking a question, can I particularly encourage you to do so if you're feeling that you're somewhat uncomfortable or not too sure if you should. We're very keen to hear from a wider variety of people if possible, and we'll do everything we can to make that happen. Okay, with that thought in mind, I'm going to look at the Google Doc that Michael has helpfully prepared for me. And I'll take one, and while you're answering it, I'll look for others. Okay. The questions so far are very technical, but actually there's one here from James Van Leeuwen, which I think is a good one. It's a direct message. He says, and this comes to the premise of tonight's talk, is there a root mass delusion? Is there something is there some, I think if I understand the question, he's trying to get at, is there something inherent, like a premise or an axiom or a fundamental part of the delusion that we need to take stock of collectively? And if so, what is it? And that's initially a question for Iain while I look through the other questions.
Well, I suppose that I would say inevitably that there is a core mass delusion, which is indoctrination into the vision of the world, which is delivered to us by the left hemisphere untempered, or relatively untempered, by the right. And so it is one orientated towards greed, gain, power. I mean, effectively, it's about power and control. And it's lost intellectual subtlety because the left hemisphere doesn't have much intellectual subtlety and is literally less intelligent than the right. It also has nowhere near the understanding of social and emotional matters of intelligence. And so inevitably, once this way of thinking becomes the standard way in which all discourse is carried on in the public sphere, and children are brought up no longer to believe in or take pleasure in all the beautiful things that are now associated with the past, because we've now moved into this brave new world where we have technical machines. We don't need to read literature and look at painting and listen to music and do drama and all these other things, or for goodness sake, develop some kind of spiritual sense of something beyond. That's, if we're like that, then it is a mass delusion, which will lead to great unhappiness, conflict, and destruction, the destruction of the valuable. That's what I see around me. People at loggerheads, much more than they were 30 years ago. Interestingly, the relationships between all the societal groups that are now so strictly policed and boundaried and so on have become worse rather than better through this process. So it's anyway, there we are.
Okay, thank you. Bonnie, do you have a direct answer to that question, or should we take some more questions?
I think that if you want to think of root causes or the root problem, I think it's one of fragmentation and alienation at all scales. So the left hemisphere wants to analytically reduce something to study it, and so it feels fragmented and separated. We feel that matter is different than life in a kind of alienated way. We feel that humans are separate from nature. We feel individualistic. We feel our countries are separate and sovereign. So this whole notion, I guess the left brain thinks it's separate from the right brain. I would say that the lack and loss of any kind of sense of understanding a deep continuity at all levels, vertical dimensions and horizontal dimensions, could characterize the sum total of the problem.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. I'd like to take a question from Lisa Marowski, if I say that correctly. Lisa, you're welcome to ask it yourself, but equally, yeah, there you go.
Hi, thank you for hosting these wonderful talks. I've really enjoyed them. The context for my question to both of you is the imagination. So I'm not really looking for a factual response. But given, as you've said, that the world is an organism and yet is being unmade, are there models such as the caterpillar becoming butterfly that Barbara Marx Hubbard refers to, that show us or could help us understand what is happening to us, help us get through this process of unmaking and remaking. And then second to that, what might we be remade into, like as the next phase of evolution? My own hunch is that endosymbiosis might give us a clue, but not the answer. So this is an imaginative question.
Thank you very much. And Bonnie, I know you might have an angle on the butterfly caterpillar metaphor from a piece of writing that I'm familiar with. Iain, if you have any thoughts initially?
Well, the caterpillar butterfly thing is extraordinary in nature, and as we know, the butterfly actually has a completely different genome from the caterpillar. So what one's seeing there is a transmogrification. What I think I'm being asked to do is to say what this butterfly is going to be like, and how we can bring about its release. And I, first of all, what it is like, I would be extremely cautious in predicting, because I do believe that one of the glories of existence is that things are not determined fully, and that when we predict the future, we are very often wrong. So I would resist being asked to make any prediction about that. I mean, although I have my own hunches, which are limited by my imagination, which are that probably some people will survive, and will survive by leading much more simple, modest lives closer to nature and closer to one another than our human lives have become. So I don't know quite how to exercise the imagination that you're asking me to exercise, except that I guess that my books are, I hope, works of imagination, and that I appeal to many great works of art and literature to illustrate my drift. But I think I'm not entirely in tune with the drift behind that, the little thrust behind that question.
Thank you, Iain. Bonnie, I want you to answer this because I know you've got a great take on this. But while I'm doing that, if Celeste Flahaven could put her hand up, please, because I want to take your question, but we can't find you after this. But Bonnie, first of all, on caterpillar, butterfly, and what lies between.
Yeah, I'll start with that, but I wanted to answer the question also in a larger context. So and I think this is a little bit building on what Iain said, is that we shouldn't imagine that the caterpillar imagines itself to be a butterfly. It's much more scary than that, right? Like if we had to voluntarily go through the metamorphosis process without understanding it, that would truly be an act of imagination, to be open and welcome and inviting surprise. But you said something beautiful. You talked about endosymbiosis. And what I wanted to say is there's many places where people are using their imaginations to thread a different story through the scientific facts. So Iain uses scientific facts, and he threads a beautiful story. And other people can use the same facts and they'll thread a different story. And so we need all science is based on what are called interaction metaphors. They're deep metaphorical assumptions about the way things are. And what we need are people who are understand the science and using it to thread a different story. And so that actually separates, I think, imagination from fantasy. So that's one thing. And the work on counterfactuals is very important. So you might say, but what if the Darwinian attitude of the survival of the fittest in complex adaptive systems is not true? Is there a story that threads the same evidence that is more aligned with goodness, truth, and beauty? So I've done that in writing speculative philosophy on complex potential states. It takes into account everything that the Darwinian attitude takes into account, but it tells a different story. So endosymbiosis is one of those great imaginative things that are emerging in our culture that want to be true to the science, but understand that there's a different story that can thread it. And that's the power of the imagination. And the other thing I want to say that is something that I think is we should do, I see there's a question on education. There's something called empathic projection, and kids do it really well when they're young. And that is, they imagine what it might be like to be a pencil. And they imagine what it might be like to be an ant. And they imagine, and in this experience, it's not like fantasy where you go away from the world. You enter the spaces in between the world that you don't understand. And this is a valuable exercise in becoming attuned to the reality of things and nature and animals. So it's a process of the imagination. It's called empathic projection.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm just keen to get other questions in. Celeste, you're welcome to ask it yourself if you're happy to do that. I think we've found you now. Can we hear you? I'm not sure we can hear you. I can see you, but maybe your volume's not on, or what's the... Shall I just ask it for you, or are you ready to go? Yeah, you're okay. Thumbs up. Okay, I can ask it for you. Well, thank you, Celeste. It was really a question about poetry. It's to do with precision of language being a kind of antidote. I'm going to get the exact wording here. But Celeste asked, here we go. Can language, especially that which is used with extraordinary deliberation and care, i.e. poetry, be an antidote to this wide-scale delusion? Can we use the tool that makes us feel tethered to our humanness to combat feelings of robotic or unintuitive existence? So you can already see the poet in the question. Iain, I'm assuming the answer might be yes, but what's the sort of bigger answer?
It's very much yes, I would say. And it's interesting, this idea of the carefully considered or precise, because of course, both here and in science, there is this interplay between the precise and the imaginative, which means that although in science you're working with something that seems very strict in its structure, in fact, the discoveries come through the exercise of intuition and imagination. There are just so many examples of this in the history of mathematics and science. And something similar could be said, of course, about poetry, but what I was alerted to by your question was the idea that there's a certain sort of precision involved as well, and that we need to be precise as the situation will allow us to be, but not a whit more than that. In other words, there is a word that is precisely right because it opens itself to a number of possibilities being experienced or felt at the same time. So the great thing about poetic language is its ability to be single and multiple at once. This is really a theme that should be throughout everything we've talked about this evening, that I feel at some points there was a tendency to say that, it's bad that there are individuals, but I'm sure that wasn't what was meant by Bonnitta. But individuals are terrifically important. What's important is that the distinction and the differences don't imply a severance. In fact, they imply a something bigger out of which they come and to which they contribute in turn. So it's always this alliance of division with union, of the individuation with togetherness and integration. And so I would say that poetry is an example of this, because in poetry, we are trying to bring together, or not trying, but allowing things that are multiple to come together in our minds in a very clear and precise way that if you changed a little bit of it would ruin it. So it has a very individual existence, but it arises from a process which is unconscious and which is about the coming together of the many into the one.
Thank you, Iain. Bonnie, don't have to add to that if you don't want to, but you're welcome to.
Okay.
I
mean, it was a beautiful answer, but there's a lot of questions.
Thank you, Bonnie. Madalena Machado, great question. You're welcome to ask it yourself, or give me a thumbs up if you're happy for me to ask it. But you're welcome to. I'd rather you asked it, much rather you asked it. Can you do it? Yeah, so you're unmuted now. You're welcome to go ahead.
Well, I'm actually quoting Gregory Bateson when he says this question, what have we here? 400 plus people on a Zoom call. Is this not radically new? What sense does it make to speak of what we've lost? Does this mostly apply to Occidentals and a cosmovision of domination, which is now eroding? Is it not about time we learn planetary interdependency for the first time together as online ancestors, because we're all online ancestors? This is basically 10 years old. This duality of technology versus life is manichaeistic. Nothing on this planet is not natural. There's nothing not natural. As Spinoza said at 24 years old, 400 years ago, with the printing press, we began propaganda fide, that was the Vatican. Now we are in a participatory age for the first time ever. Can we give ourselves permission not to know? And honestly, this is what I feel Bonnitta is teaching at the pop-up school, which I've joined. And it has, for me, for example, I'll just add one little footnote. In the Tupi language, in the Amazon, there's no word for sin. There's no word for temptation. There's no word for kingdom. I mean, what would our language be languaging had those concepts not, abducted our capacity to think differently? Thank you.
Wow. Well, I would love to ask you some questions, Madalena, another time maybe. But for now, Iain, do you want to respond to that? Bonnie, Iain, if you want to pause for some thought. Bonnie, do you have a more immediate response?
Yeah, because I think it ties into the previous question on poesis. So Magdalena is saying, what would our language be like? And I think, there's poetic language is a contemplation on ideas or things that language seems to contradict, right? So how can everything already be nature? And is nature then destroying itself? Is nature unmaking the world is like the question. If everything's nature, then isn't this just nature unmaking the world? And I think this kind of tension, if you sit with it in a certain way, so you have both trust and doubt and belief and skepticism and confidence in the intellect, the intelligence of the world, and humility, then something like poetry comes out. And we might imagine that that's something that shares with earlier languages. So I would say that's how it seemed to me that as the question came up right after the last question.
Iain?
I wasn't really quite sure what the question was. I heard that we were in a more positive way, we could communicate with one another and so on. Then there was a sudden remark about the word sin, which, by the way, not only in the Tupi language, but also across many parts of the world, there isn't such a word. But what am I supposed to deduce from this?
If I dare give my own interpretation, the reason I chose Madalena's question, it reminded me of a colleague and friend, Idra Adnan, who was on a Zoom call a bit like this one with several hundred people from across the world. And one of the speakers was lamenting how disconnected we all were, how we've lost connection with each other. And she's saying, what the hell are you talking about? Look at this extraordinary process that we're part of. Who knows where this might lead? This is the beginning of something amazing. And we should all get over ourselves and stop complaining and start using the technology we have to, you know, reckon with the no doubt profound problems we have, but also to trust that something is emerging that's of great value and promise. And as I understand Madalena's question, I think she's just using that as a counterweight to the sense that things are inevitably collapsing. Something is also arising.
That is right. And if we could find a way of using the interconnecting capacity sparingly when it is really important, and not allowing all the dross that comes with it to drown out the good, then that would be a marvelous thing. But I remember when I went to Johns Hopkins in 1922, 1992, I'm not that old. In 1992, I was in a lab looking at scans of brains, and the head of the department came in and said, "You guys are great. You know, the work you're doing is great, but you know what we need is more communication." And I was already aware that in England had started this sort of over-communicative style. And in America, it was already a huge problem. People spent so much time recording, communicating, and so on, that the actual business of what they were doing got somehow left behind. And I said, actually, what we need is to communicate less, but to communicate when it's really important. So I do think this is I'm not saying this just to be sort of a bit flippant. There is a huge problem with what technology is doing to our attention. It is fighting for our attention, which has been monetized, and destroying our attention is destroying our intelligence, destroying our capacity to imagine. It is degrading at the level of our experience and of being. So this is a worry to me. I love the fact that we're all here on this call, and so it's best to focus on the good bits. And but there are mighty problems as well. And
Sure.
Also, I'd just like to say, in the way that the coincidence of opposites works, is that if there is too much cacophony and too much, actually people fall out with one another and don't actually become closer to one another. So it's a really difficult one to call that. Life is complex. It's not just a simple question of there being more or less communication. What is the quality of that communication is a very important question.
Can I just follow up? I think to put it short, I think communication like this is neither necessary nor sufficient to stop the unmaking of the world. And so but it can be helpful or it can be harmful. But to think that it's either necessary or sufficient, I think is both of those are a mistake. And I agree with Iain. The cost in general is currently outweighing the benefit.
The new chip, non-Heraclitean, Iain says, well, it's not sufficient, but it might be necessary to have these sorts of conversations.
No, but I mean technology, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
yes.
I do like the chipper, Iain, as you know. Listen, can I encourage everyone here to please take a look at the chat, because there are some mind-blowingly good questions in there, and I'm really very grateful for all of them. Back in the day when I worked at the RSA, I chaired quite a lot of events, and before I started doing that, Matthew Taylor, who was the chief executive at the time, taught me that it's always better to end an event leaving people wanting more rather than drag on with further questions, even though there are great questions to come. So I'm going to leave you with that thought and end now. I'm very grateful for all the questions that haven't been aired, but they are there in the chat. You can write them down. We will take note of them. They may come up again. I noticed some about education, about parenting, about love. Great stuff. There will be more. There will be another of these events in 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks after that, and another 2 weeks after that. Watch this space for more information. There's also a connection and inquiry session. As I say, those of you on this event will now be signed up to Perspectiva's mailing list. So you will hear from us about all of those things very shortly. But I really want to just thank you all for being there. It's been a great attendance and some lovely questions. And I'm very, well, particularly grateful to Bonnitta Roy for beaming in from Connecticut, to Iain McGilchrist, of course, for beaming in from Skye. And I just want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll come back and bring your friends. So with that thought, enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.